Hello, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for the webinar. So today's webinar is part of enhanced support around net zero for the social enterprise sector in Wales, delivered as part of the Social Business Wales programme and funded by Welsh Government. So today we'll be looking at enabling agroecological farming systems, and more specifically, the role of local and short supply food systems. Our speaker, Tony Little, has been involved in supporting and developing organic and agroecological food and farming systems in Wales for over 20 years. He's worked at Organic Centre Wales, Social Farms and Gardens, Land Workers Alliance, and currently runs his own business, the Sustainable Farming Consultancy. In today's webinar, Tony will explore local and short supply chain food systems and give an overview of the main business models and discussed how this can be scaled up in future. So Tony, I will hand over to you.
Perfect, thank you, Nick. Yeah, so one of the things I really wanted to look at today is the relationship between supply chains and markets and farming systems. And that relationship is absolutely critical, but I think quite often not really well recognized or perhaps not well understood. So just today, I just want to look at how those two things interact and what we can do by changing our food systems to create the conditions that allow us to run more sustainable farming systems. But before I want to do that, I just want to take a very quick look back at intensive farming systems and really how they developed. So this is a really potted history, but I just want to pull out the key points that are going to be relevant later on. So I think the sort of modern intensive systems really have their roots in the period just after World War II, when there were chronic food shortages all across Europe, including the UK, and there was a real and urgent need to increase productivity within the UK, and that led us towards the model that we've got now. So we've got larger and more specialist farms, and there's increasing reliance on external inputs and technologies. So there were a number of technologies emerging at the time that absolutely transformed the way that we farm. The Haber-Bosch process was discovered in about 1900, and that's the process by which we can basically fix atmospheric nitrogen out of the air chemically. So I say that was not a new process, but by the time we got to the 50s, it was really being employed on an industrial scale, and suddenly synthetic fertilizers were available in enormous quantities and really cheaply. Other things that were coming forward were synthetic pesticides, and they were being developed as new chemistries. Again, the sort of 40s, 50s, 60s were the time when those synthetic pesticides started to really be produced in volume and economically. That at the same time, or rather later, we had, I think, what's known now as the Green Revolution, which was a revolution in plant breeding. And the focus for this, again, was really on high-yielding varieties, and they were very closely linked back to the input. So they were bred to produce really high yields in conditions where there was lots and lots of nutrients provided by the fertilizer, and in situations where the pest and disease pressures were being dealt with by synthetic sprays rather than as being part of an intrinsic tolerance of the plant. So later, again, sort of in the 90s, we start to have GMOs. So all of these technologies are building on each other and creating conditions where we have a farming system that is very reliant on external inputs, and we'll talk about the carbon implications of that in a moment. And you know, there's no getting away from it. As a policy, as a strategy to increase productivity of food, it was phenomenally successful. But there have been some huge costs. But before we go on to those, I just want to take a look and show you the fertilizer production from from the 1900s. As I say, the process was discovered around about 1900, and you can see very, very small quantities of fertilizers being produced up until the 40s, and then about the 50s onwards, there was this massive incentive to produce huge quantities of fertilizer, and that same trend, I think, would be just as applicable to pesticides. We're going back to that environmental cost. So the cost of manufacturing these inputs is absolutely colossal, but also in the case of fertilizers, it's not just the implications are not just about applications. There's a process called nitrification, in which essentially the nitrogen fertilizer breaks down in the field, and that releases nitrous oxide, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas. And the use of chemical fertilizers contributes something like 2.2 gigatons of carbon equivalents per year. So that is more than the entire emissions from global aviation put together. So it's a it's an enormous, enormously carbon emitting process. That other implications of that, so the soil degradation. So we've moved away from sort of natural processes of fertility building, which would build up organic matter, which is really important for a number of reasons. It's really important for soil structure. It's really important for soil biology. It's really important for soil carbon, because that's where the carbon is stored. And reliance on these inputs is essentially degraded soil, and you can see in that picture on the right, the structure has essentially been damaged, and that soil has just been washed out by heavy rain, and that's, I think, a feature of some of the really intensive, particularly arable systems. Also, enormous reduction in biodiversity. So a big part of that is habitat destruction. Clearing fields, removing hedgerows to make fields larger and efficient, draining wetlands in the uplands, putting drains in. All of these sorts of processes have destroyed an enormous amount of habitat. Plus, the direct use of pesticides has really decimated the populations of particularly insect, but these pesticides are quite broad spectrum, and indeed have led to the demise of other groups of animals as well. Enormous amount of pollution, and so fertilizers and pesticides running off into rivers, for example. And I mentioned earlier the breeding program was moved very much towards the increase of yields, and the effect of that really has been to narrow the genetic diversity that we've got in our plants, and that's having genetic diversity is really important strategy for dealing with climate change, and we essentially reduced our resources, our genetic resources, to deal with climate change quite substantially. I just want to take a quick look at the role of policy, because again, this is going to become important as we look at some of the solutions that we might put in place. So the common agricultural policy was really, in its early days in the 60s, was really focused on production. So farmers got a subsidy for every sheep they kept, every cow they kept, every hectare of wheat they produced. So there was enormous incentive for farmers to produce as much as they possibly can. And this, again, in policy terms, was wildly successful. There was an enormous amount of food produced, so much so, by the time we get to 1980, our problems are not to do with underproduction, it's to do with overproduction. And I think we all remember the days of butter mountains and milk lakes and all that sort of thing. And that was very much as a result of the common agricultural policy. But it was all about productivity, and it was a key reason and that underpins sustainable farming practices in that time. So we've got a policy that's really driving us towards ever more productive, ever more intensive production systems. It took about 25 years to turn that tanker around and start to put in place a policy that moved away from productivity incentives. So in theory, farmers were paid now to look after land rather than produce food. But the subsidy system is still very, very, very central to the economics of farm practices. And in the late 90s, we began to see agri-environment schemes that were coming in, and that's essentially compensating farmers for farming in a more sustainable, more wildlife-friendly way. And we've seen those develop, and they're very much with us today. And we finally arrive at post-Brexit, where we are in a situation where public money for public goods is very much what the scheme is about. So we've moved away from this idea that we pay farmers simply for owning and managing land, and require certain environmental actions for that money. And I think that's a really, really, really positive move. But again, we'll pick up some of those issues later. So we've talked a lot about farming systems and productivity, but what about the food system that developed alongside that? And just as farms have scaled up, so have food systems, and what we've seen is the development of large-scale, really centralised food systems, and that's the supermarkets are probably the most common manifestation of that, but we also have large wholesale and catering operations, but they are they essentially rely on bringing together large volumes of produce and processing them centrally. So a typical supermarket supply chain, you might grow the carrots in one place, wash them in another, pack them in a third, and what makes this work is the sheer scale of the operation. And these systems grew and increased. Car ownership was a really important part of that, because people had to get to supermarkets in order to purchase. And certainly the perception, at least, of consumer choice was something that the supermarkets really, really tapped into. They started in the 1950s, and now over 80% of food sales in the UK are through supermarkets. And again, this is, if the object was to provide cheap and plentiful food to 60 million people, it's a very successful model, but it has enormous costs attached to it. And the first thing I want to talk about is the power structure, and this is absolutely central to the promotion of intensive farming systems. So we now have 8 supermarkets that control the UK's food supply, and that gives them enormous power, and that gives them enormous power over the prices that they can pay, and they've been able to drive those prices right down, so that the margins for farmers are absolutely tiny, or even non-existent, and on average farmers will receive something like 8% of the retail price of the product. Farmers are at the bottom of that system, and they frequently absorb all of the costs of unfair supermarket trading practices. So supermarkets can cancel last minute with impunity, invoice deductions, significant penalties for short supply, and the bargains that you see, the bog offs, the special offers, all the things that supermarkets use in price wars against one another. The cost of that is mostly picked up by farmers. So it's a grossly unfair system for farmers, and it's because of this structure where we've got these very few companies controlling the whole food system that situation is able to proliferate. You can also imagine they wield enormous political power and influence. Clearly, the food supply to the nation is a very, very important political issue, and the supermarkets can have a lot of say in that. I think I read in the Guardian a couple of weeks ago that Sainsbury's is the largest single donor to both the Conservative and Labour Party. So they basically have the whole food system sewn up. That they also have serious impacts on the local economy. So retail staff are notoriously low paid. It also means essentially sucking out all of that money out of the local system. So for every £1 spent in a supermarket, only £2.40 is retained in the local economy. The rest goes to supporting the headquarters of the system, or the large-scale contractors. Very, very little of that money is actually spent in the location in which the food is purchased. Independent retailers are frequently driven out of business, and local food structure has practically disappeared in many places. So I'm talking about things here like small-scale processing equipment. Abattoirs is probably the biggest and most serious example of where local infrastructure has been completely undermined by big centralized food systems. The environment, the impact on the environment has been really crucial. This is actually one of the most important points that I want to get across in this presentation, is that it's the centralized food system with those tiny margins. That is what is driving the intensive food system. If your margins are really tiny, the only way out of that situation is to produce as much as you possibly can at the smallest financial cost. And the intensive food systems that we have are the answer to the question, how do we achieve that? Our systems are highly, highly dependent on cheap and abundant fossil fuels. So perhaps transport is probably the most obvious area where that is the case, but also the manufacture of all those inputs. Going back to what I was saying about nitrogen fertilizers, the packaging, which the production of ultra processed foods. All of these are really, really, really energy intensive. Big impact on health. The cheapest diets are the worst for you. They tend to be very low in fruit and veg, very high in very nutrient poor processed food, lots and lots of salt and sugar and saturated fat, and the impact of those is much, much greater on communities with lower incomes. So you can see on that slide on the right comes from NHS England. The level of childhood obesity is more than twice as high in deprived areas compared to the least the least deprived areas. So there are all sorts of problems, quite significant problems that arise from the mainstream, very intensive food system that has developed over the last 60, 70 years for all the reasons that I've just described. So what is the alternative, and to what extent can a different, more local food system help us address some of those problems? And I want to get across here the concept of food sovereignty, and that's basically the idea that people have a right to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced ecologically and sustainably in a way that through ecologically and sustainable methods, but in a way that they can define their own food and agriculture systems. And that sense of power and agency over your own food system is absolutely crucial to this. So what are the models of local food, what are the local food models, and the short supply chains that I've been talking about. So direct sales, where the farmer sells directly to customers. I think we're probably all familiar with most of these: box schemes, market schools, farm shops, online shops, and pick your own. I think we've all come across. Community supported agriculture is a slightly different way of building the relationship between producer and consumer. It's really about a partnership. So the idea is that the communities and producers share the risk. So, for instance, instead of selling the communities a box of vegetables at a fixed price, communities pay for a share of the harvest from that particular that particular farm. So, and in doing so, when they've had a good season, then they get a lot of value for their share. When times are difficult, when you've had pest and disease problems or weather issues, then the price stays the same, but your share is smaller. But what you're doing is you're supporting and enabling your local food producers to survive and thrive. And it's seen, as I say, very much as a sort of partnership. So short supply chains, there's an intermediary involved here. So that intermediary might be a sort of fairly traditional but smaller local wholesaler. It might be hospitality and catering businesses, independent stores, food hubs. Food hubs are becoming increasingly important. And I think for reasons I'll talk about later, I think one of the most effective models for delivering a fair and resilient and sustainable food system. So sort of look at some of the benefits of these systems, and the key one, I think, in the context of this webinar is that the farmer gets to hold on to a much greater proportion of the retail price. So if you remember, I said in the supermarket systems it's about 80%. Farmers can usually expect to retain somewhere between 60 and 100% of the retail price in these local and short supply chain systems. Businesses, when small local businesses tend to be much more agile and better respond to shocks. I think a really good example of this we saw right at the beginning of the COVID restrictions, and supermarkets were really struggling to maintain supply. Small local businesses were able to pivot. So, for instance, the small businesses that were reliant on the hospitality businesses, which of course closed down very quickly, were able to switch to box schemes or online shops really quickly. And there's that agility and ability to respond that builds in resilience into local and small supply, the local and short supply chain systems. Quite often, the farmers and producers are supplying a number of different markets, so their risk is spread across those markets, and they're really good at retaining money in the local economy. So I said before, about every £10 spent in supermarkets, 240 remains in the local economy. With local systems, you've got the multiplier effect. So actually, £10 spent on local food systems leads to approximately £25 being generated in the local economy, and that's through things like using local drivers, local shops, local contractors. That's paying for creating jobs for people to put market stalls up, all of that sort of thing. So all of that money is not only staying in the economy, but actually being used to generate income. And of course, it creates far more jobs. So on farms in particular, sort of small-scale organic wood culture creates one of the highest number of jobs in farming systems. And again, as I was saying before, you've got all of those sort of process and retailers and local services, and those jobs are being created by local food systems. The environmental benefits, and again, just to pick up on the point I was making earlier, those higher price margins, that is what enables the producers and gives them the wriggle room to be able to farm in a way that is environmentally friendly and sustainable, but also enables them to stay viable and make money as a business. And these organic and agroecological systems have got huge and well documented benefits. That's increasing the diversity within the farming system. So that's the amount of crops and the varieties, but also in natural biodiversity. Using biological systems, you're putting organic matter back into the soil. You're driving the biology of that soil, improving the structure, increasing the organic matter, constantly trying to cover the soil as much as you possibly can, so that we don't get the situation in the earlier slide when I showed where we have huge quantities of degraded soil being eroded. Also because organic systems completely prohibit the use of nitrogen fertilizers, so you have a huge decrease in pollution. The use of pesticides is very restricted. So we're picking up all of these environmental benefits. But as I say, the reason that farmers could do this is because they've got those greater margins and those fairer prices at the market. That's again, I mean, a lot of this is looking at the carbon mitigation strategies and net zero. So the greenhouse gas emissions are reduced. We've got less processing. We've got less packaging. A recent study that estimated that if we swap the domestic production of vegetables for imported, then we would reduce greenhouse gases by about 11% and our water footprint by about 1.1%. The emissions of transport, I think, are slightly more complicated. So there are clear reasons why local and short supply chain systems do have lower carbon footprints. So certainly minimal air freight and shorter distances. So you don't have carrots traveling around the country being packed, washed in different places. However, I think moving smaller quantities of produce around more often, more frequently, has a higher carbon cost. So I think those benefits are offset to some extent. But certainly overall, there's a really cast iron case that local agroecological systems have a much lower carbon impact. Reduced waste, and some of the ways in which centralised supermarket systems generate waste are perhaps not immediately obvious. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that farmers and growers face huge penalties if they are not able to supply sufficient to supermarkets. And they usually mitigate against that by planting an extra, whatever it is, 10, 20%, expecting, and like the yield from that 10 to 20% is a cushion against, it's an avoidance strategy of these short supply penalties. So in local food systems, you don't have that issue, and therefore you don't have that mechanism of waste. There's often much closer matching between supply and demand, so through direct relationships and communication channels. So you know the level of overproduction is usually really small, and there's a much greater tolerance of cosmetic damage in local food systems. Healthier food, the reduced processing, I think, is probably a key element of the benefits here. It is simply not possible or feasible to reduce the sort of ultra processed foods that are the worst for us in small scale systems. That the farming system also reduces pesticide residues and then heavy metals, and it's for those reasons tends to produce healthier food. And I think the close connection between farmers and local communities, particularly I would say with CSA projects, I think is a really important vehicle to drive behavioural changes and keep better diets. And that's all great, but we have one big elephant in the room, and that is the issue of scale. And the sorts of systems that I've just been describing account for less than 15% of all the food purchased in the UK. And this is particularly the case in some of the large urban populations, so-called food deserts. So there are a very small number of people who are able to access and benefit from local and small and short supply chain systems. And I was indicating before, that small proportion tends to be the better off, more wealthy sections of society. And actually, if we're going to have a local and short supply chain food system that's going to be fit for purpose, then it has to scale up to an order of magnitude. So instead of serving a few million people now, we need to be looking at serving tens of millions, 20 or 30 million. And how do we achieve that? There's two ways to scale. There's scaling up, which is essentially increasing the size of businesses, or the scaling out, which is increasing the number of businesses. And I think both are absolutely crucial if we're going to achieve this level of scaling up. But I think scaling out is so important for a number of reasons. So if you've got lots of interconnected businesses working together, you don't get the situation where 8 companies control the entire food system. And if you don't have that level of inequality in the system, then you don't get these situations where margins are so small, and therefore you have a food system, a farming system that is able and set up deliberately to deliver fair, environmentally sustainable food. So I think that the scaling out element of it is really important. And that's been quite difficult, but there are some really significant developments in IT that are starting to make that possible. And I think one of the most important of those is the food data collaboration project. And I don't understand the details of this, but essentially what it is doing is building systems that allow different companies to access each other's data in situ, if you like. So there isn't a need to centralize all the data in one place and then access it out. Companies can share information with one another directly. And why is that important? That's important because suddenly it enables us to achieve economies of scale while remaining fairly as fairly small scale businesses. So we can share logistics, we can share processing, we can share administration, and if we can do that on a big scale, and the food data collaboration and the IT systems that are in place allow us, and in fact are designed specifically to enable us to do that, then we start to have a food system and a food structure that can feed everybody, but also distribute the benefits fairly across the whole supply chain, and essentially deliver us a food system that works for everybody. So as you can tell, I think this is enormously exciting, and I think that we're going to see this really develop over the next few years. So how do we actually do that scaling up? And I think the first thing we need is a coherent strategy and a coherent plan, and that plan has to have buy-in from all the stakeholders, so governments, communities, farmers, growers, supply chain businesses, and retailers. And this is a process that's going on at the moment. The Landmarks Alliance is leading a project which is trying to do exactly this. That it needs to facilitate cooperation across the supply chain. So that is things like setting up cooperatives and group working and all of these kind of things that are really, I think, quite difficult intrinsically, but also particularly difficult in the UK because it's not in our culture, if you like, to cooperate. So I think there's a lot of work needed to help farmers and growers cooperate. There is a really great need for a national fund for small-scale infrastructure and facilities, all the things that I mentioned before, process facilities, abattoirs. And this needs to be prioritised on the basis of all of the benefits that we've been talking about. That's our political justification for setting up and accessing this fund. Our processing facilities need to be regional, and tax incentives for local food retailers, I think, could be a really powerful way of moving this forward. We've got a huge opportunity to create a market for local and sustainable food through public procurement, and I know Louise is going to be talking about this in some detail in about a week's time, I think. But creating a market and creating that opportunity for small-scale producers is really important, and we're starting to see some really good work in Wales. There's 5 projects, I think, separate projects around Wales doing this, and the political case that enables and persuades county councils to work more closely with local food systems, I think, is increasingly strong. At the moment, planning system is an obstacle to small-scale producers, and I think that we could. I think changes in the planning system would be an enormous enabler, not only to limit the spread of supermarkets, but also things like that permitted development rights for smaller for smaller producers. I think enabling access to land for food producers near peri-urban systems, making it easier to set up value-added processing for small-scale producers. All of these things, I think, are within our gift. And I think if we do all of these things, I do think that there is a really, I think it is not only possible, but also entirely necessary to change the food system in a way that benefits everybody. Any thoughts and questions?